Alice had always known herself to be her father's princess, a title he lovingly bestowed after her mother's passing when she was just 4 years old. Her memories of her mother were faint, replaced by her father's unwavering affection and lavish attention. Growing up, Alice became accustomed to never refusing anything. Traveling abroad became routine during her geography lessons. Whenever the teacher mentioned the Egyptian pyramids or the grandeur of the Taj Mahal, Alice proudly raised her hand, having already seen these wonders firsthand. Weekend trips to the Indian Ocean and breakfasts in Paris were normal for Alice, who had grown comfortable with airplanes, constant flights, and changing time zones. By the age of 10, she was fluent in French, Spanish, and had a basic understanding of Chinese, a result of her father's insistence on the best tutors, often native speakers, though the streets of Barcelona, Paris, or Shanghai taught her more than any textbook ever could. Despite the revolving door of nannies and governesses, none could replace her mother. Her father, plagued by guilt, showered her with expensive gifts and vowed she would never have to endure an evil stepmother. But at 15, everything changed when her father met Cassandra. Their relationship started casually, a calf here, a theater there, but he soon grew captivated by Cassandra's femininity, calmness, and independence. Unlike the women who pursued him for his wealth, Cassandra genuinely cared for him. They bonded over their shared loss. Cassandra had also lost her husband, and her daughter was the same age as Alice, which seemed serendipitous to her father, who thought a sister would be the perfect friend for his daughter. Introducing Alice to Cassandra proved challenging. At their first meal together, Alice's behavior was atrocious, rude and boorish, as if she'd forgotten her manners. The tension stifled any chance for her father to announce his plans to marry. Though Cassandra remained composed, Alice's behavior infuriated her father. Later that night, he confronted Alice in her room, bewildered by her conduct. Her defiant response only fueled his frustration until he finally explained Cassandra's significance. Devastated, Alice questioned her father's promise never to remarry, feeling betrayed by his plans to propose. Her father, trying to soothe her, explained that life had moved on from her mother's passing and that Cassandra was now an important part of his life. Alice, tearful and fearful of losing her father to another woman, struggled to accept the impending changes. And then, her father hesitated, upsetting Alice further. By the way, Cassandra has a daughter. She's 15, just like you. After the wedding, she'll be living with us too, of course. Stunned, Alice clutched her eyes and rushed out of the room. This news was too significant and serious to digest so suddenly. Her father sighed, watching her retreat. Well, I didn't quite envision the conversation going like that, he muttered to himself, but at least the worst part is over. The main thing is that I've told her, now she just needs to accept it. He desperately hoped that Alice's heart would soften, that her anger would turn to understanding. He had envisioned peace and harmony in his family, but he was about to be proven wrong. After the wedding, Cassandra and her daughter Tracy moved in with Mark and Alice. Alice took an instant disliking to Tracy. She found her too arrogant, behaving like a queen with everyone around her as her subjects. What irked Alice the most was how her father, seemingly eager to please Tracy, catered to her every whim to ensure she never felt like a guest or a stranger in his house. Alice couldn't bear it. She felt jealous of her father's relationship with another girl, resentful of his new wife, and often felt like she didn't belong in her own home. She understood that her father was trying to balance his relationship with her while building one with his new family members, but she wasn't making it easy for him. Conflicts that were rare before now erupted frequently, sometimes over trivial matters. Mark began confiding in Cassandra about Alice's behavior, and Cassandra, playing the role of understanding wife, would smile knowingly. It's just a phase, dear, she would reassure him. She'll grow out of it. Alice knew that before marrying her father, Cassandra wasn't wealthy, and Tracy attended an ordinary high school. Now, Tracy acted as if she were accustomed to luxury, though she never had fancy clothes or expensive gadgets before. Alice found it maddening. She couldn't stand Tracy and Cassandra's entitled behavior, especially their complaints about the quality of breakfast mangoes from Thailand or Parmesan cheese from Italy not meeting their standards. Alice knew Cassandra used to be an office manager who snacked on fast food. Where had these airs of royalty suddenly come from? Her father, blissfully happy in his new marriage, was blind to the pretense and artificial taste. While Alice addressed Cassandra by her name, Tracy immediately began calling Alice's father Dad, further irritating Alice. What kind of father is he to her, really? Alice wondered bitterly. Meanwhile, Tracy harbored her own disdain for Alice and constantly did nasty things to her in secret. They were now studying together in a prestigious language gymnasium where Alice had been going since the first grade. At school, Alice kept her distance, not publicizing that Tracy was her half-sister. However, their classmates eventually found out. Tracy quickly ingratiated herself with many classmates, including Alice's best friend Juliet, who shared their desk. Alice noticed the girls whispering secretively and giggling more often, which infuriated her. Why would Juliet confide in her so-called sister, and what were they whispering about? Alice couldn't shake the feeling they were discussing her. Gradually, her relationship with Juliet changed. Alice noticed Juliet avoiding her and spending more time with Tracy. Eventually, Juliet couldn't avoid the tension any longer. I didn't expect this from you, Alice. I thought I knew you well. We've been friends for so long, but you're not who I thought you were. Juliet's words confused Alice deeply. What do you mean? Alice asked, bewildered. How can you treat Tracy like that? Juliet's accusation caught Alice off guard. She and Tracy didn't get along, but it wasn't one-sided. Blaming Alice alone seemed unfair. What do you mean? Why do you pretend not to understand? Juliet's frustration grew. Tracy told me everything. How do you treat her like a servant, make her clean your house and room, feed her leftovers, dress her in your old clothes, constantly scold her, call her names? Alice was shocked. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Where did you hear this? Why would I ever do that? I'm not a monster. Juliet shook her head. Because you're jealous of your dad. Angry that he loves Tracy like his own. You're used to being the center of attention, Juliet accused. Tracy confided in me, sharing her pain. It's shameful how you treat her. Alice struggled to respond. It's all lies, she managed to say. I don't stop my dad from buying clothes for her. He's completely revamped her wardrobe. And we eat together at the table. Leftovers? That's nonsense. And I don't make her do all the cleaning. We have a housekeeper. Alice thought she'd clarified everything, but Juliet just sighed sadly. That's what Tracy said. She knew you'd deny it, so she asked me not to tell you I know. But I can't stay silent about such injustice. Alice, when did you become so heartless? Alice felt tears welling up. Can't you hear me? I'm telling you it's all lies. Why believe some stranger over a friend you've known for years? Juliet shrugged. Why would she lie? She has no reason to make you look worse. So you believe her so easily and sympathize with her lies? Alice's bitterness was palpable. Juliet didn't respond. She gathered her things and left without a goodbye or a backward glance. The next day at school, Juliet moved to Tracy's desk, leaving Alice confused and hurt. It felt like Juliet had discarded years of friendship for Tracy's lies. And that was just the beginning. Tracy's rumors spread among their classmates. Soon, everyone treated Alice like a monster who hated Tracy and wanted to ruin her life. Alice felt powerless. No one would believe her if she tried to defend herself. She tried to stay strong outwardly, but inside, she seethed with anger. She despised Tracy with all her heart. Then the rumors reached the teachers. One day, Mrs. Cannon, their teacher, detained Alice after class. She looked uncomfortable and unsure how to start. Alice, dear, she finally began, are you all right? Alice was surprised by the question, unsure where it was coming from. She was still getting top grades, and she'd kept her turmoil hidden from everyone. Could Mrs. Cannon really see her sadness? Yes, I'm fine, she answered cautiously. Why do you ask? I'm worried about your sister, the teacher sighed. She didn't turn in her homework again today. Alice shrugged, unsurprised. Tracy was lazy, often spending all day in bed glued to her phone or computer, neglecting her schoolwork. I understand it must be difficult for you to accept her into your home, Mrs. Cannon said awkwardly, but try to manage your feelings and resentment. Alice blinked in confusion. Alice's situation with Tracy and the fallout with her classmates and former best friend, Juliet, paint a vivid picture of the complexities of family dynamics and school life. The story highlights the challenges Alice faces when Tracy spreads false rumors about her, causing widespread alienation and misunderstandings among their peers. Despite Alice's attempts to defend herself and maintain her integrity, Tracy's manipulations and the ensuing rumors significantly impact Alice's relationships and reputation at school. Mrs. Cannon's intervention adds another layer of distress for Alice, as the teacher believes Tracy's fabricated stories and admonishes Alice for behaviors she didn't commit. This further isolates Alice, leaving her feeling powerless and misunderstood. Alice's confrontation with Tracy in Tracy's room, where she threatens retaliation if Tracy continues spreading lies, shows Alice's frustration and desire to regain control over her life. Tracy's quick retreat into submission suggests she fears the consequences of Alice's anger, leading to a fragile truce between them based on mutual avoidance. The resolution of their relationship, where they coexist without interacting, reflects Alice's resignation to maintain peace rather than seek genuine reconciliation. This choice allows Alice to reclaim some sense of normalcy at school, with her classmates gradually accepting her again, albeit with lingering doubts and scars from Tracy's deceit. Alice's estrangement from Juliet and her strained relationship with her father and stepmother underscore the lasting impact of Tracy's manipulation. Alice's feelings of loneliness and alienation deepen, as she perceives herself as an outsider in her own family, overshadowed by Tracy's favored status. Overall, the story delves into themes of betrayal, resilience, and the harsh realities of teenage social dynamics, illustrating how false accusations can fracture relationships and reshape identities. Through Alice's journey, it explores the emotional toll of being falsely accused and the challenges of navigating family and peer relationships in the face of adversity. Alice's journey from school to university and then into the professional world at her father's firm showcases her growth, determination, and desire for independence. Her initial struggles at the company, her insistence on being treated like any other employee, and her eventual adaptation and success are testaments to her perseverance and work ethic. Despite the challenging start, Alice's dedication pays off, and she gradually finds her footing in the corporate environment. Her decision to rent her own apartment and furnish it herself symbolizes her newfound independence and maturity. This step towards self-sufficiency, coupled with her refusal of financial help from her father for a home, underscores her resolve to build her life on her terms. In contrast, Tracy's reliance on their father's connections and finances highlights the difference in their approaches to life. Tracy's dependence on her foster father's resources contrasts sharply with Alice's desire to achieve things independently, illustrating their distinct values and aspirations. Alice's first self-funded vacation to the seaside marks another milestone in her journey. The encounter with Paul on the airplane introduces a new dimension to Alice's life. Paul's politeness and kindness immediately make a positive impression on Alice, who finds herself unexpectedly intrigued by him. Despite her initial shyness and inexperience with men, Alice's interest in Paul signals a potential for personal growth and new experiences. Paul's friendly demeanor and sincere smile help Alice overcome her initial embarrassment, leading to a relaxed conversation between them. This interaction suggests the possibility of a meaningful connection, as Alice finds herself drawn to Paul's charm and appearance. Alice's reluctance to engage in romantic relationships in the past, preferring the comfort of books and TV shows, may stem from her focus on personal and professional growth. However, meeting Paul seems to awaken new emotions and curiosity in her, hinting at the beginning of a potential romantic journey. Overall, Alice's story is one of resilience, independence, and gradual self-discovery. Her determination to succeed on her own terms, her evolving relationships with her family, and her budding interest in Paul all contribute to a narrative of personal growth and the pursuit of a fulfilling life. When Alice was a little girl, she traveled with her father, but she didn't remember much from those trips. Now, as an adult, she found herself embarking on a new adventure, one she could remember and cherish. On her flight to Istanbul, Alice was seated next to Paul, a charming and polite man who quickly struck up a conversation with her. "If you like, I'll be your personal guide to Istanbul," Paul offered with a sly smile. Alice, surprised and delighted, realized he was flirting with her. It was unusual and very exciting for her. "I'm just in love with this city, and I've been there 1,000 times," Paul continued. "I'll show you all its most interesting corners. I'll take you to the best cafes and restaurants. I'll give you the best coffee in the world." "It sounds tempting." Alice smiled, "but won't you be bored spending your vacation with me?" "Not bored, of course. On the contrary, you'll brighten my loneliness." Are you flying alone and not with your family or friends? Alice asked cautiously, trying to find out if her new acquaintance was married. I have no family, the man said nonchalantly, and no girlfriend either. I was supposed to fly with a buddy I've been friends with since high school, but he came down with food poisoning at the last moment. He had to cancel the trip, and I was left alone. Alice mentally rejoiced at the fact that her new acquaintance was single and free, but she immediately scolded herself for thinking he was interested in her as a woman. He could offer his services as a chaperone just out of boredom. But sometimes she caught glances from Paul that said otherwise, that he socialized with her not just because he was bored and didn't care who he talked to. In his eyes, she saw an unconcealed interest and even admiration. "And what hotel are you staying at?" she asked. Paul named it, and Alice was surprised by the pleasant coincidence. "It's fate, no other way," said Paul, looking at her so penetratingly that she blushed. Her new acquaintance had indeed arranged an unforgettable tour of Istanbul for her. The first night after her arrival, he took her to dinner at one of the most expensive and prestigious restaurants overlooking Golden Horn Bay. The restaurant was open air and located at a great height with a view of the Bosphorus. In the evening, live music played in the restaurant, mingling with the cries of seagulls, and the air was filled with the appetizing odors of food and the sea. "Don't look at the prices," Paul warned her immediately, noticing her squinting warily at the menu. "I invited you, so I'm paying for dinner." Hearing this made Alice even more tense. What if he now thought she owed him something? But Paul could read her thoughts, or maybe they were just written on Alice's face. Noticing her confusion, he smiled affectionately and easily covered Alice's palm with his. "Don't worry," he said softly, "it's just dinner. You won't owe me anything." Alice finally relaxed, trusting him completely. He courted Alice touchingly, and he didn't make any attempt to hug or kiss her or say any greasy compliments. When the cab brought them back to the hotel, Paul gallantly escorted Alice to her room and said good night, politely kissing her hand. "Tomorrow morning, I'll invite you to a real Turkish breakfast," he said with a smile. Alice voluntarily smiled back at him. "Our Turkish breakfast special?" she asked. He winked slyly. "You'll find out." The next morning, he took her to one of the old neighborhoods of Istanbul where everything seemed to breathe history. Alice was surprised when Paul took her to a small, completely unpretentious-looking cafe. The table they sat down at was covered with oilcloth. "I understand you're surprised," Paul grinned, "but don't jump to conclusions. Try it first." And then the waiter began to bring dishes one by one to their table. Alice only had time to blink in shock. First, a copper skillet with glazed scrambled eggs appeared on the table, then slices of fresh cucumbers and tomatoes, another skillet with fried, flavorful sausage, braised vegetables, black, green, and pink stuffed olives glossy with oil, several types of cheese, different varieties of jams including fig and quince and honey, butter, a wicker basket with hot bread or rather bagels thickly studded with sesame seeds, and to finish it off, Turkish tea. Alice's eyebrows rose higher and higher in surprise at the appearance of each new dish. Noticing her reaction, Paul laughed. "Yes, one Turkish breakfast conveys a whole elephant." Frankly speaking, Alice had an appetite just looking at all these dishes, so she pounced on the food with gusto. "It was divine," she said at last, leaning back in her chair, "but it seems I won't be able to swallow a single bite for 10 years. Appreciating her joke, Paul smiled contentedly. "Don't worry, now we'll go for a walk. Everything will be fine." The young man turned out to be an excellent tour guide. He showed her almost all the historical monuments of Istanbul. He took her to both the European and Asian parts of the city, and after a couple of days, Paul even organized a trip to the Prince Islands located a couple of dozen kilometers from Istanbul. They swam in the sea, rode rented bicycles, and also arranged a picnic on one of the picturesque hills. Alice had never been so happy. A few days after their arrival, Paul decided to gently kiss her. Alice did not resist. After all, she herself had long dreamed of it. From that day on, the relationship moved to a new level. It became a relationship not just of buddies having fun together, but the relationship of a couple in love. Alice was literally overwhelmed by hurricanes of feelings and emotions she had never known. It was both great and scary, like being on a roller coaster. She tried to chase away the treacherous thoughts of what would happen to them next. While they were having a wonderful time together, they were both clearly in love, or at least attracted to each other. But the vacation would soon be over, and they would have to go home. Would Paul want to continue communicating after returning to Moscow? Alice was very frightened by the thought of it, but she did not dare ask Paul directly. She was afraid he would find her too intrusive. 2 weeks quietly flew by like a blink of an eye, and now it was time to pack a suitcase. Paul had to fly away 2 days later, and Alice was already sad in advance, preparing herself for the fact that he would not take her phone number or address. Why would he? He had a great time with her in Istanbul, but back in the capital, he had another life, other things to do, and other worries. She didn't fit into his usual circle. But the problem was she didn't want to forget him. She was ashamed to admit it, not only to Paul but even to herself. It seemed she had fallen in love up to her ears for the first time in her life. From the strength of her feelings, she wanted to scream, but she didn't give herself away. The morning of the day of departure was gloomy and overcast. It was raining, and her mood matched the weather. Alice irritably packed her things and mentally prepared for the upcoming separation. Paul had disappeared since morning, and her cab was arriving soon. Was he avoiding her deliberately? Was he afraid she would start sobbing, confessing her love, and begging for a future meeting? Alice sniffed dismissively. If he was hiding, she wouldn't look for him. When she had stowed all her things in her suitcase with difficulty, zipping it up, Paul burst into the room. "I changed my ticket," he announced gleefully, "so we'll fly together." Alice stared at him in disbelief. "What do you mean you've changed it? You still have 2 whole days of vacation. You're supposed to leave the day after tomorrow, right?" "I was supposed to, but I don't want to," Paul shrugged. "What am I going to do here without you? Everything will be empty and boring. I don't want to be here a day without you." Realizing he was serious, Alice felt her lips stretch into a happy smile against her will. "Really? Because of me?" Paul shook his head as if surprised by her naivety. "Because of who else, Alice? I'm crazy about you from the very first look, as soon as I saw you. And will we?" She swallowed the lump in her throat because the words were difficult. "And will we continue to communicate at home?" Paul widened his eyes in feigned surprise. "Of course, we'll continue. How could we not?" His face became suddenly preoccupied. "If that's what you want, of course," he added cautiously. Alice nodded. "I really, really want to." "Well, that's great." Paul hugged her and pressed her tightly against him. "I don't want to let you go anywhere away from me. I'll never let you go." That's how their romance started. Paul gave Alice flowers, gifts, invited her to theaters and movies, and took her to restaurants. A week later, Alice moved from her rented apartment to live with him. One day, she embarrassingly reported that her father very much wanted to meet him. "Dad invited you and me to dinner on Saturday. He can't wait to see you," she said. "He wonders who stole his daughter's heart." "I wanted to meet him too," Paul said. "After all, a man should ask a girl's hand from her father, as it should be according to the old custom." Alice was speechless. "A girl's hand? Do you mean my hand, Paul? Are you kidding?" He shook his head. "Not at all. Wouldn't you like to be my wife?" She bit her lower lip. "It's too sudden. I have to think about it." Paul made a fierce face and growled, deliberately menacingly, "What is there to think about? We're already living together as husband and wife. You love me, don't you?" "I do, but—" "No buts. We love each other. We can't live without each other. So we should legalize our relationship, live happily ever after in love and harmony, and have tons of kids." Alice gasped and laughed. "Tons of kids? 4 or 3? I don't agree to less." Paul said it seriously. "I've always dreamed of a big friendly family." "But, so you'll marry me?" Stubborn Alice nodded cheerfully. "Yes, yes, and yes again." When they arrived at Alice's father's house and got out of the car, the road was suddenly blocked by a gypsy woman. "Don't go there, beauty," she said, staring at the girl with unblinking black eyes. Alice shivered. She didn't believe in fortune-telling and other paranormal nonsense, but the gypsy's words suddenly made her uncomfortable. Even a chill ran down her spine. At first, she wanted to ignore the beggar and pass by, but she couldn't resist and asked, "Why?" The gypsy shook her head without taking her eyes off Alice. "Don't go," she repeated. "You will give your happiness with your own hands to someone else's." "What nonsense," Alice muttered, confused. Fortunately, Paul entered the conversation. "Why are you listening to her?" he asked. "You know that gypsies are clever manipulators. The only thing she needs from you is money." I don't need money, though, the gypsy woman firmly objected and repeated like an incantation, looking at Alice. Don't go. Paul resolutely took Alice by the arm and led her away, saying, Don't pay any attention to that mad woman. Although Alice persuaded herself it was nothing, her mood was slightly spoiled. However, during the family dinner, Alice cheered up and relaxed completely, forgetting about the strange gypsy. Everything went wonderfully. Her chosen one really liked not only her father but even her stepmother and stepsister. Paul solemnly and officially asked Alice's father for her hand, and the father even shed a tear, giving his consent and blessing. Tracy was drenched with jokes and witticisms. Alice did not recognize her. You have a very nice sister, Paul whispered in the bride's ear. You told me that your relationship is not good. I had such a monster in my imagination, but she's not bad at all. Alice did not dissuade him, although she was surprised to see such a change in Tracy. When it was time to say goodbye, Alice and Paul were about to leave, and Tracy also jumped up from the table. I better go too, she said. Will you guys give me a ride home? I don't have a car today. Yes, of course, with pleasure, nodded Paul, and Alice only shrugged her shoulders confusedly. There was no reason to refuse her sister. All the way, Tracy continued to talk incessantly. In general, she behaved like a real chatterbox. Alice, she said when they parted ways, maybe it's time for us to bury the hatchet and start communicating like sisters should. Surprised by this suggestion, Alice hesitated for a moment. I know, Tracy said quickly, that I've done many nasty things in the past and you have every reason to dislike me. But believe me, I've changed a lot since then. I have numerous regrets, but we can try to start over. I miss having someone who is really close to me, a sister friend. Let's try, huh? Alice felt strange, but Tracy's words sounded sincere. All right, she nodded at last. Let's give it a try. Great, Tracy clapped her hands with joy like a child. To strengthen our friendship. Paul and Tracy stood frozen as the gypsy woman approached. Her dark eyes, unblinking and intense, locked onto Tracy's. The guests murmured, unsure whether to intervene or wait to see what would happen next. Don't go through with this, the gypsy woman said softly but firmly, her voice carrying a weight that silenced the murmurs around them. Who are you, and what do you want? Tracy demanded, trying to sound assertive but unable to hide the quiver in her voice. The gypsy woman's gaze didn't waver. You will bring misfortune upon yourselves if you marry today. Paul finally found his voice. This is absurd, he said, though he sounded more unsure than he intended. We don't believe in such things. Please step aside. The gypsy woman shook her head slowly, her expression one of sorrow rather than defiance. It's not about belief, it's about fate. You have a choice to make. Tracy, feeling the weight of everyone's eyes on her, tried to push past the gypsy woman, but the older woman stepped into her path again. Listen to me, she implored, her tone softening. I mean no harm. I only wish to warn you. There is still time to change your path. Paul looked at Tracy, seeing the fear in her eyes. We should just go, he said quietly, trying to reassure her. This woman doesn't know anything about us. But the gypsy woman's words had sown a seed of doubt in Tracy's mind. She looked at Paul, then back at the gypsy woman, torn between the life she had planned and the ominous warning she had just received. Tracy's stepmother, who had been watching the scene unfold with growing concern, stepped forward. Enough of this nonsense, she said sharply. We're going inside. Now. Paul nodded, taking Tracy's hand and leading her toward the entrance of the registry office. The gypsy woman did not follow, but her final words echoed in Tracy's mind as they walked away. You will give your happiness with your own hands to someone else's. Inside the registry office, the ceremony proceeded, but the mood had been irreparably tainted by the strange encounter. Tracy could not shake the feeling of unease that settled over her, and Paul, too, felt a lingering sense of foreboding. As the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, and they shared their first kiss as a married couple, the gypsy woman's warning still hung heavy in the air. Tracy's mind was a whirl of conflicting emotions, joy at being married to the man she loved, fear of the unknown future, and guilt for what she had done to Alice. The rest of the day passed in a blur of celebrations, toasts, and well wishes, but Tracy felt disconnected, as if she were watching herself from outside her body. Paul, too, seemed distant, his usual easy smile replaced by a forced expression of happiness. That night, as they lay in bed, Tracy turned to Paul. Do you think what she said? Do you think it could be true? Paul sighed, pulling her close. No, Tracy. It was just a coincidence. Someone trying to scare us. We're together now, and that's all that matters. But even as he spoke, he couldn't help but wonder if there was some truth to the gypsy woman's words. The seed of doubt had been planted, and neither he nor Tracy could predict how it would grow. In the days that followed, Tracy's unease only grew. Small arguments turned into heated disputes, and the joy they had once shared seemed to slip through their fingers like sand. The happiness they had envisioned seemed increasingly out of reach. And far away, Alice began to rebuild her life, unaware that the turmoil her sister and Paul were experiencing. She focused on her career, her friends, and slowly, painfully, began to heal. The gypsy woman's warning, dismissed and forgotten by those who had witnessed it, lingered like a shadow over Tracy and Paul's marriage. They had ignored the chance to change their path, and now they would have to face the consequences of their choices. Tracy tried to recoil, but the gypsy suddenly pulled off her veil. The bride shrieked in fright, and the guests were left dumbfounded. Staring intently into Tracy's face with her black eyes, the gypsy laughed ominously and said, "The real bride is different." "What are you talking about?" Tracy demanded, but the gypsy grinned and lowered her gaze to Tracy's belly. "And you're not pregnant. It's all a hoax." Tracy grew nervous and asked for the crazy woman to be taken away, but no one moved. It was as if the gypsy had hypnotized them. Suddenly, the gypsy turned to the crowd of guests and announced, "There will be no baby." She tricked her sister's fiancé to bed. She slipped sleeping pills into his drink and then called a cab to his house. Everyone was shocked into silence, with only the bride shrieking, "What are you talking about? Where did you get that from?" Paul suddenly seemed to wake up from his forgetfulness and stared greedily at the gypsy. "What did you say?" he asked quickly. The gypsy woman grinned and said, "You were clean before your true bride. With that liar, you had nothing. You just fell asleep. She undressed, got into bed with you. No pregnancy. Nope. She was hoping to get pregnant after the wedding. She was always jealous of her sister, so getting you away from her was a matter of principle." Paul turned a fierce look on Tracy and asked, "Is it true?" "Why do you believe this mad woman?" she mumbled, but her face turned red. Paul shook his head and said, "She's not crazy. I remember when Alice and I were coming to dinner at her father's house. This very woman blocked our way and warned us not to go there. We just laughed at the prophecy and didn't believe it, but it turned out to be true." There was an unimaginable uproar as everyone talked and argued at the same time, trying to digest the information they had received. Alice's father stepped toward his stepdaughter and looked angrily into her eyes. "Tracy, is it true? Don't you dare lie to me. I'll find out anyway." Tracy's eyes frantically darted back and forth. "But why are you picking on the poor girl?" screamed her mother. "Can't you see she's scared enough as it is?" But Mark only shook his head and warned, "Don't interfere, Cassandra. I asked your daughter a question." The gypsy woman, listening to the conversation, nodded. She was helping her daughter. It was her idea with the sleeping pills. She didn't want to miss out on such an inviolable suitor. Paul angrily threw off the bride's hand, still clinging to his elbow. "I felt that something was amiss in the matter because I couldn't get so drunk that I couldn't remember who I'd spent the night with. And I'm not usually hitting on strange women when I'm in love with only one. And how come the idea of sleeping pills didn't occur to me at once?" On the groom's shoulder lay the strong hand of Alice's father. "I am glad it is only a monstrous lie and a mistake," he said. "Go to Alice. She is suffering a great deal. She is not well without you." Paul smiled broadly. "At last, I can go to her with a clear conscience. All this time, I despised and hated myself, thinking I'd cheated. And now I'm the happiest man in the world." In a minute, the groom jumped into the car and drove away. The guests stood dumbfounded in front of the registry office, not knowing what to do now. Tracy sobbed in humiliation, and her mother tried to comfort her. Alice's father looked for the gypsy woman to thank her. However, there was no sign of the mysterious woman. It was as if she was just a vision. Soon after the incident, Alice's father divorced Tracy's mother. He couldn't forgive her complicity in what had happened, nor his daughter's tears and suffering. As for Alice and Paul, they were pleased together and got married as soon as possible. A year later, they gave a days with joy grandfather his first grandchild. Now, when they met gypsies on the streets, they no longer shunned or avoided them. On the contrary, they gave generously, as if in gratitude to the woman who had once saved their love.